Karen's face twisted into a furious scowl as she glared at the German shepherd sitting calmly on the sidewalk. "That mutt is trespassing on my property," she shrieked, her voice shrill and grating. The dog's owner, a young man in a crisp police uniform, tried to interject. "Ma'am, I assure you this is not your property. This is a public sidewalk, and my K-9 partner is simply—" "I don't care what you say," Karen interrupted, spittle flying from her lips. "That animal is disturbing the peace, and I won't stand for it a moment longer." She whirled around and stormed towards her front door, yanking it open with enough force to shake the frame. The officer watched in bewilderment as she disappeared inside, his brow furrowed in confusion. His K-9 partner, Raven, simply sat and gazed up at him, tail wagging gently. Moments later, Karen emerged wielding a wooden baseball bat, her eyes wild and unfocused. "I'm calling the police," she shouted, gripping the bat with white knuckles. "You have 5 seconds to get that beast off my property before I take matters into my own hands." The officer's eyes widened in alarm. "Ma'am, please put down the bat. I am the police, and this is my K-9 partner. You're making a mistake." 5. Karen screamed, taking a menacing step forward. The officer's hand instinctively moved towards his holster. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to." 4. Karen shrieked, raising the bat above her head. Raven, sensing the escalating tension, let out a deep, guttural bark. 3. The officer's fingers curled around the grip of his service weapon. "Ma'am, I'm warning you." 2. Raven rose to all fours, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in her chest. 1. Karen's eyes narrowed, her muscles tense and ready to strike. In one fluid motion, the officer drew his firearm and aimed it at Karen. "Ma'am, drop the bat now," he commanded, his voice stern and unyielding. Karen froze, the bat wavering in her grip as she stared down the barrel of the gun. What is the meaning of this?" she stammered, her bravado faltering. "You are interfering with a police K-9 unit," the officer stated, his finger poised on the trigger. "Put the bat down slowly and keep your hands where I can see them." Trembling, Karen complied, the bat clattering to the ground as she raised her hands in surrender. Raven let out a sharp bark, her ears perked forward, eyes fixed on the woman. The officer kept his weapon trained on Karen, never taking his eyes off her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the door and lie face down on the ground. Now." Karen's eyes went wide with panic as she slowly lowered herself to the ground, her face pressed against the concrete. "This is outrageous," she cried, her voice muffled. "I demand to know what's going on." The officer approached cautiously, his gun still drawn. "Ma'am, you've assaulted a police K-9 officer. That's a serious offense." He crouched down, keeping a safe distance, and quickly patted Karen down, removing her cell phone and a set of keys from her pockets. "This is completely unacceptable," Karen shrieked, her body trembling with rage. "I pay my taxes, and I won't be treated like some common criminal." The officer ignored her outburst, calmly securing Karen's hands behind her back with a pair of handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Karen's face flushed a deep crimson. "You can't do this to me. I know my rights, and I demand to speak to a lawyer." "You'll have your chance, ma'am," the officer replied evenly, helping Karen to her feet. He guided her towards his patrol car, Raven following closely at his side. As they reached the vehicle, the front door of a neighboring house burst open, and a middle-aged man came rushing out. "What's going on here?" he shouted, his eyes darting between the officer and the handcuffed Karen. The officer turned to face the newcomer. "Sir, please stay back. This is a police matter." "But that's my neighbor, Karen," the man exclaimed, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What on earth is happening?" Your neighbor assaulted a police K-9 officer, the officer explained, his tone firm but professional. I'm placing her under arrest. Karen's head snapped up, her eyes burning with fury. That's a lie. She spat. This man is harassing me, and I demand that you arrest him instead. The neighbor looked taken aback, his gaze shifting between the officer and Karen. I don't understand. Karen would never do something like that. The officer sighed, his patience wearing thin. Sir, I witnessed the entire incident. Your neighbor threatened my K-9 partner with a baseball bat. I'm going to have to ask you to step back and let me do my job. The neighbor hesitated, his brow furrowed in concern. But, sir, I won't ask you again, the officer interrupted, his voice stern. This is a police matter, and I need you to cooperate. Reluctantly, the neighbor stepped back, his eyes filled with uncertainty as he watched the officer guide Karen into the backseat of the patrol car. As the patrol car pulled away, the neighbor stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Karen, his longtime neighbor and fellow member of the HOA board, had never been anything but polite and reasonable. The idea of her assaulting a police officer's dog was simply inconceivable. Shaking his head in disbelief, the neighbor hurried back into his house and grabbed his cell phone. He scrolled through his contacts, his fingers trembling, until he found the number he was looking for. Hello, this is James from the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, he said, his voice slightly shaky. I need to speak with the president, Helen, as soon as possible. It's an emergency. A few minutes later, the phone rang, and the neighbor quickly answered. Helen, thank goodness you called back. Something terrible has happened. Helen's voice, tinged with concern, came through the line. What is it, James? What's going on? It's Karen, the neighbor explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. The police just arrested her for assaulting a K-9 officer. I don't understand it. She's always been so reasonable and law-abiding. This has to be some kind of mistake. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Karen, arrested. That doesn't sound like her at all. Are you sure there's no confusion? I wish that were the case, James replied, running a hand through his hair in frustration. The officer said he witnessed the whole thing. He said Karen threatened his dog with a baseball bat. Helen let out a soft gasp. That's simply unbelievable. Karen would never do something like that. She's been on the HOA board for years, and she's always been a model citizen. I know, James agreed, his brow furrowed in worry. That's why I wanted to call you right away. This just doesn't add up, and I'm worried about what it might mean for the association. Well, you can't jump to any conclusions just yet, Helen said, her tone measured. We need to gather more information and see how this plays out. In the meantime, I think it would be best if you kept this within the HOA for now. We don't want this to become a bigger issue than it already is. James nodded, even though Helen couldn't see him. Understood. I'll keep you posted on any new developments. Thank you, James, Helen replied, her voice tinged with concern. This is a delicate situation, and we need to handle it with care. I'll be in touch. With that, the call ended, leaving James to stare at his phone, his mind whirling with unanswered questions. What could have possibly driven Karen to such a drastic action? And how would this affect the homeowners association he had dedicated so much of his time to? As the patrol car sped away, Karen sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her back, seething with rage. How dare that officer arrest her, the pillar of the community, for simply trying to protect her property from that vile, trespassing animal? She glared at the back of the officer's head, her nostrils flaring with each labored breath. You have no idea who you're dealing with, she muttered under her breath, her voice laced with venom. The officer, seemingly unfazed by her hostile demeanor, calmly navigated the streets, his K-9 partner Raven sitting calmly in the passenger seat. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remain quiet and cooperative, he said, his tone professional and unwavering. Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. Cooperative? You expect me to be cooperative after you've humiliated me in front of my neighbors and treated me like a common criminal. The officer's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but he remained composed. Ma'am, you threatened the police K-9 with a weapon. That's a serious offense, and I had no choice but to respond accordingly. Respond accordingly? Karen spat, her voice dripping with sarcasm. You pointed a gun at me in my own front yard. Do you have any idea who I am? I'm aware that you're a member of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, the officer replied evenly. But that doesn't give you the right to assault a police officer or their K-9 partner. Karen's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward as much as her cuffed hands would allow. Well, let me tell you something, _officer_. I know people in high places, and you've just made a very powerful enemy. This isn't over by a long shot. The officer glanced at her briefly in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. Ma'am, I'd advise you to save your threats for the judge. In the meantime, I suggest you start thinking about how you're going to explain this to your neighbors and the HOA. Karen's face flushed with rage, and she opened her mouth to retort, but the officer cut her off. We're here, he said, pulling the patrol car into the parking lot of the police station. He quickly exited the vehicle and opened the rear door, ushering Karen out and escorting her towards the entrance. As they approached the building, Karen's eyes darted around nervously, her bravado beginning to waver. Wait, what's going to happen to me? Where are you taking me? The officer's expression remained impassive. You're being booked on charges of assaulting a police K-9 officer. From here, you'll be processed and held for arraignment, where a judge will determine if you'll be released on bail or held in custody. Karen's heart raced, and she felt a chill run down her spine. But I can't be held in custody. I have a homeowners association meeting tomorrow, and I'm the treasurer. You can't do this to me. The officer simply shook his head, his grip on her arm tightening as he led her through the station's doors. I'm afraid the law doesn't make exceptions, ma'am. You'll have to take this up with the judge. As the sun began to set, James paced anxiously in his living room, his mind racing with a whirlwind of thoughts. He had called Helen, the HOA president, to alert her to Karen's arrest, but the conversation had done little to ease his concerns. The idea of Karen, a respected member of the community, being arrested for assaulting a police K-9 officer simply didn't add up. Karen was known for her attention to detail, her unwavering adherence to the rules, and her fierce devotion to the homeowners association. Threatening a police dog with a baseball bat was completely out of character. James paused, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Something just didn't feel right about this whole situation. He knew Karen could be stubborn and unyielding when it came to HOA matters, but violence? That was a line she would never cross. Determined to get to the bottom of this, James reached for his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. He needed to speak with someone who could provide more insight into the events that had unfolded earlier that day. After a few moments, he found the number he was looking for and pressed the call button. The phone rang a few times before a familiar voice answered. Officer Daniels? This is James from the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. I was hoping we could talk about what happened with Karen earlier today. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Greenfield, I'm surprised to hear from you. I can't really discuss the details of an ongoing investigation, but I can tell you that Karen was arrested and booked on charges of assaulting a police K-9. James frowned, his brow furrowing in concern. But that's just it, Officer Daniels. Karen is one of the most law-abiding, responsible people I know. It just doesn't seem like something she would do. Another pause, this one slightly longer. I understand your concern, Mr. Greenfield, but I can assure you that I witnessed the entire incident firsthand. Karen threatened my K-9 partner with a weapon, and I had no choice but to intervene. But there must be some kind of misunderstanding, James persisted, his voice tinged with desperation. Karen is the treasurer of our homeowners association. She's essential to the smooth running of our community. Surely, there's a way we could resolve this without her facing serious charges. Officer Daniels sighed heavily. I'm sorry, Mr. Greenfield, but the law is clear on this. Assaulting a police K-9 is a serious offense, and I'm obligated to follow the proper procedures. Karen will have to answer for her actions in court. James felt his heart sink, a sense of dread washing over him. I see. Well, thank you for your time, Officer Daniels. I'll be sure to keep the Homeowners Association informed of any updates. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Greenfield, the officer replied, his tone somber. But I would advise you to let the legal process play out. In the meantime, I'd suggest you start preparing the association for Karen's potential absence. With that, the call ended, leaving James to stare at his phone, his mind reeling with uncertainty and a growing sense of unease. The future of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association suddenly seemed much more uncertain than he had ever imagined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Karen paced the confines of her holding cell, her mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, indignation, and a growing sense of panic all vied for dominance within her, making it difficult to focus on anything but her predicament. How dare that arrogant officer treat her, the treasurer of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, like a common criminal? She had worked tirelessly to maintain the pristine image of their community, ensuring that every rule and regulation was upheld to the letter. And now, all of that was in jeopardy because of some overzealous cop and his mangy dog. Karen's lips curled into a snarl as she replayed the events of the day in her mind. She had simply been trying to protect her property, her home, from the trespassing animal. She had every right to defend her territory, especially when the authorities failed to do their job. And yet, she was the one being punished, forced to rot in this cold, sterile cell while her precious homeowners association meeting was happening without her. A shiver of fear ran down her spine as she thought about the potential consequences. What would the other board members think? Would they believe the officer's version of events, or would they stand by her, their trusted treasurer? And what about the association's finances? Would they be able to function properly without her meticulous oversight? The sound of approaching footsteps outside her cell snapped Karen out of her thoughts, and she whirled around to see a uniformed officer standing at the door. Ms. Wilkins, the officer said, his voice neutral. The judge is ready to see you for your arraignment. Karen's heart raced, and she straightened her posture, trying to maintain an air of composure. Finally, she huffed, it's about time someone with a modicum of sense gets involved in this travesty of justice. The officer simply nodded and gestured for her to follow. Karen reluctantly complied, her hands still cuffed behind her back, and allowed herself to be led through the maze of hallways and into a small courtroom. As she entered, Karen's eyes scanned the room, searching for any familiar faces. To her dismay, there was no sign of her neighbors or fellow HOA board members, just a stern-looking judge sitting behind the bench and a few other officers. The judge fixed Karen with a piercing gaze. Ms. Wilkins, you stand accused of assaulting a police K-9 officer. How do you plead? Karen lifted her chin defiantly. Not guilty, Your Honor. This is all a terrible misunderstanding, and I demand to be released immediately so I can return to my duties at the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. The judge's expression remained impassive. I see. Well, given the serious nature of the charges and the fact that you have no prior criminal record, I'm inclined to release you on bail. However, I have one condition. Karen felt a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly tempered by the judge's stern tone. And what, pray tell, is that condition? You are to have no contact with the K-9 officer or his partner, and you are to stay at least 500 yards away from the police station at all times, the judge declared. Failure to comply will result in your immediate remand into custody. Do you understand? Karen's jaw tightened, but she knew she had little choice. Yes, Your Honor, she gritted out, her eyes burning with resentment. The judge nodded. Very well. You're free to go, Ms. Wilkins, but remember, I'll be watching. As Karen stepped out of the courthouse, her mind was whirling with a maelstrom of emotions. Relief that she had been released on bail, but also a burning sense of indignation and a growing fear of the consequences that lay ahead. Quickly, she retrieved her belongings from the officer and hurried to her car, her eyes darting around nervously, as if the police were about to swoop in and drag her back to the station at any moment. Once safely behind the wheel, Karen took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had to get back to the homeowners association and assess the damage. Who knew what sort of rumors and speculation were swirling among the other board members and the residents? With a renewed sense of determination, Karen started the car and headed straight for the Oak Ridge Community Center, where the monthly HOA meeting was no doubt already underway. As she pulled into the parking lot, Karen's eyes narrowed and her grip on the steering wheel tightened. There, standing at the entrance, was James, the nosy neighbor who had stuck his nose where it didn't belong earlier that day. Steeling herself, Karen stepped out of the car and marched towards the building, her head held high. She wasn't about to let a little run-in with the law ruin her reputation or her standing within the association. "James," she called out, her voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. "I see you're still sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." James whirled around, his eyes widening in surprise. "Karen, I didn't expect to see you here. I thought." "You thought what?" Karen snapped, cutting him off. "That I would just roll over and accept being humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood. This is my homeowners association, and I'm not going anywhere." James held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Look, Karen, I'm just as surprised by all this as you are. I called Helen, the president, to let her know what happened. But—" "Oh, I'm sure you did," Karen interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "And I can only imagine the colorful version of events you shared with her." "I was just trying to understand what happened," James protested, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Karen, you've always been such a pillar of the community. This just doesn't seem like something you would do." Karen let out a derisive snort. "Well, you're going to have to take my word for it, James. I did nothing wrong, and I'm not about to let some overzealous cop ruin my reputation or the reputation of this association." Before James could respond, the sound of the community center's front door opening drew their attention. Helen, the HOA president, stepped out, her expression a mixture of concern and trepidation. "Karen," she said, her voice measured, I'm glad to see you. We were all rather concerned about what happened earlier." Karen straightened her posture, her chin held high. "Well, you can rest assured, Helen, that I'm perfectly fine. And I'm here to resume my duties as treasurer, just as I always have." Helen hesitated, her gaze darting between Karen and James. "I see. Well, the board would certainly welcome your return. But perhaps it would be best if we discussed this matter in private first." Karen's eyes narrowed, her suspicion palpable. "I have nothing to discuss, Helen. I've done nothing wrong, and I demand to be reinstated immediately." The tension in the air was palpable as the three stood locked in an uneasy standoff, each unwilling to back down. The silence stretched, thick and uneasy, as Karen, Helen, and James stood facing each other, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Finally, Helen cleared her throat, her brow furrowed with concern. "Karen, I understand you're upset, but surely you can see how this incident has raised some serious questions within the association." Karen's eyes narrowed, her lips pursed into a tight line. "Questions? What questions could possibly need answering? I am the treasurer, and I have faithfully upheld my duties for years. One run-in with an overzealous police officer does not change that." Helen exchanged a brief glance with James, her expression uncertain. "Well, the thing is, Karen, the board is concerned about the potential impact this could have on the association's reputation. We can't simply ignore the fact that you were arrested, even if the charges were ultimately dismissed. Karen's jaw tightened, and her fingers curled into fists at her sides. Reputation. This is about my reputation. After all I've done for this community, you're going to let some fabricated charges from a rogue cop tarnish everything I've worked for. James stepped forward, his voice hesitant. Karen, we're not trying to attack you or your character. But you have to understand, the board has a responsibility to the entire community. We can't just sweep this under the rug. Sweep it under the rug, Karen exclaimed, her voice rising in pitch. I am the treasurer, James. Without me, this association would crumble. How dare you even suggest that I should be sidelined or removed from my position? Helen raised a placating hand. Karen, please, let's not get ahead of ourselves. No one is talking about removing you from the board, but we do need to discuss how we're going to address this situation with the community. Karen's eyes narrowed to slits, her gaze darting between the two. Address it. There's nothing to address. I was falsely accused, and I've been cleared of all charges. End of story. But that's just it, Karen. James interjected, his voice tinged with concern. The charges may have been dismissed, but the incident is still a matter of public record. The residents are bound to find out, and they're going to have questions. Karen let out a derisive snort. Let them have their questions. I have nothing to hide, and I certainly don't owe them any explanations. I've done nothing wrong, and I refuse to be treated like a criminal in my own community. Helen's brow furrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. Karen, you must understand that this isn't just about you. As the treasurer, your actions reflect on the entire association. We need to find a way to address this that protects the integrity of the organization. Karen's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. Protect the integrity of the organization. I underscore the integrity of this organization, Helen. And if you and the rest of the board can't see that, then perhaps it's time for me to reconsider my role here. With that, Karen turned on her heel and stormed towards the community center, leaving Helen and James standing in stunned silence. The future of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association had never seemed more uncertain.